What if the gods of Africa didn't disappear, but were pushed into silence? What if the foundations of modern faith, power, and identity were built over truths deliberately buried beneath sand, fire, and rewritten memory? And what if the oldest spiritual war in human history didn't end? It just learned how to hide. Tonight, the story opens a sealed chapter, the last war of the old gods. A time when Africa wasn't a footnote, but a spiritual axis of the world. When deities weren't myths but governing forces. When balance, not conquest, shaped civilizations, until that balance became inconvenient. This is the story of how an ancient African pantheon was reframed, fragmented, and quietly replaced. Not erased by swords alone, but by narratives, translations, and the subtle art of forgetting. A war fought in symbols, scriptures, and memory itself. And here's the uncomfortable part. The echoes of that war are still shaping belief systems, politics, and identities today. The past you were taught to see as distant may be far closer than expected. So take a breath. If this kind of hidden history speaks to you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from, because ancestral memory doesn't respect borders. Before ink touched papyrus or stone learned to carry law, Africa already breathed history through ritual and memory. Kingdoms rose guided by stars, iron, and ancestral codes older than most calendars dare to admit. This wasn't myth as entertainment, it was structure, governance, and cosmology fused as one. Funny thing is, modern timelines call this prehistory, as if memory only counts once Europe starts writing it down. But something restless lived beneath that golden age. Stories whispered of powers that didn't fade, only shifted form, hiding in names, symbols, rhythms. What later scholars labeled as myth once dictated harvest cycles, coronations, and war. And yeah, it's ironic how the same voices that dismissed these systems later borrowed their symbols and called them revelations. Across the Nile, the Sahel, and the forests of West Africa, sacred orders aligned human destiny with cosmic balance. Deities weren't distant idols, they were principles in motion: iron, breath, fire, fate. When a king ruled, it wasn't divine right, it was divine accountability. Break the balance and the land itself responded. Then came the first fracture, not with fire or blood, but with doubt. New interpretations crept in, subtle at first, carried by trade routes and soft-spoken prophets. Unity began to thin. What was once many forces in harmony started being reframed as chaos, superstition, something that needed correction. History loves that word. Still, nothing truly vanished. The old names lingered in songs, in drum patterns echoing at dusk, in rites performed far from prying eyes. And as one era quietly closed its gates, another shadowed chapter prepared to unfold, one where memory itself would become the battlefield. Power doesn't vanish overnight, it reorganizes. As ancient alliances weakened, the old pantheon began to feel the strain of a changing world. Trade routes expanded, borders blurred, and with them came new ideas wrapped as progress. What once flowed as sacred continuity started to fracture into competing truths. Funny how new light often arrives by dimming what was already shining. Some deities were reshaped rather than erased, their attributes trimmed, their stories softened or sharpened depending on who was telling them. Iron gods became violent spirits, tricksters became devils, mothers of creation were reduced to folklore. It wasn't random, it was strategic. Control the meaning, and you don't need to destroy the source. Priests noticed first. Temples still stood, rituals still breathed incense into the air, but something felt off. The silence between drums grew heavier. Initiations carried warnings now, not just blessings. Knowledge once shared openly began retreating into inner circles, guarded by oath and consequence. Meanwhile, foreign scribes wrote confidently about lands they barely understood. They catalogued beliefs as curiosities, stripped of context, then archived them as relics of a less advanced mind. Irony again, many of their sacred symbols mirrored what they dismissed, just with new names and better marketing. By the time swords and crosses followed words and scrolls, the ground was already prepared. Memory had been loosened, faith had been reframed, and somewhere between adaptation and survival, The old gods realized this war wouldn't be fought in the open. It would be fought inside stories themselves. When the invasion finally took physical form, it didn't arrive as chaos, it arrived as order. Banners fluttered, doctrines marched, and salvation was offered with conditions attached. Ancient shrines were renamed, then repurposed, then quietly dismantled. All in the name of truth, of course. History has always loved a clean narrative. The old rituals didn't disappear. They went underground. Fires burned lower, chants softened, symbols shrank to gestures hidden in plain sight. What once filled plazas now lived in forests, caves, and midnight gatherings. The gods weren't gone. They were learning how to survive silence. Some deities resisted more fiercely than others. Spirits of iron, war, and thresholds clashed hardest with the new moral codes. They were labeled dangerous, corrupting, incompatible with the new world. Funny how anything that teaches autonomy suddenly becomes a threat. Artifacts began to vanish, masks were seized, staffs melted, sacred texts retranslated until their spine broke. Archaeology would later call this loss unfortunate. Those who lived through it called it intentional. Knowledge isn't fragile, it's targeted. Yet even as names were erased, patterns endured, rhythms crossed oceans. Symbols re-emerged, stitched into new faiths, new flags, new revolutions. And beneath every forced ending, the old question lingered. If the gods were truly defeated, why was so much effort spent making sure no one remembered them? Silence became a strategy. What couldn't be destroyed was reframed as absence, as if forgetting were a natural process and not a carefully managed one. Generations grew up hearing fragments without roots, gestures without names, and somehow that was supposed to be enough. It rarely was. Across deserts and coastlines, stories adapted. A serpent here became wisdom elsewhere. A sky father changed accents, not essence. Flood myths traveled light, shedding geography but keeping their warning. Scholars would later call these coincidences. Elders smiled at that. Coincidences don't repeat with such precision. In hidden groves and behind closed doors, rites continued with altered rhythms. A drumbeat slowed, a chant lost a syllable, a symbol faced a different direction. Small changes, deliberate ones. Survival required camouflage. The sacred learned how to pass as ordinary. Ironically, the more the old systems were denied, the more they resurfaced in unexpected places. In rebellions, in secret societies, in philosophies that spoke of balance while pretending to invent it. Power has a habit of leaking through cracks in the story, and so the tension deepened. The world moved forward claiming progress, while something ancient waited patiently beneath the surface, listening, remembering. Because the war wasn't finished, it had only learned how to hide its next move. Time did what armies couldn't. It scattered the people, chains crossed oceans, and with them traveled memory disguised as instinct. Languages were stripped, names rewritten, yet something stubborn survived in breath and rhythm. Funny how the ones declared broken carried entire cosmologies in their bones. On distant shores, the old gods learned new masks. They answered to different names, wore borrowed saints, hid behind candles and hymns. Outsiders thought it was conversion. Initiates knew better. It was translation under pressure, not surrender. Rituals adapted to survival. Water replaced rivers, drums replaced temples, bodies replaced stone altars. The sacred condensed itself, becoming portable. What once required a kingdom now lived in a circle, a whisper, a heartbeat, timed just right. Meanwhile, official history congratulated itself. It spoke of civilization delivered, souls saved, darkness erased. The irony cuts deep, because the very structures holding these new societies together echoed African spiritual lore, just stripped of its credit. As centuries turned, something unexpected happened. The fragments began calling to each other again. Across continents and cultures, echoes aligned, and with that alignment came a quiet realization. Dispersal hadn't ended the story. It had set the stage for something far more dangerous. Remembrance. Remembrance never announces itself loudly. It starts as curiosity, a strange pull towards symbols no one taught but everyone somehow recognizes. Young minds began asking why certain rhythms felt like home, why certain stories sounded familiar, despite never being told. History called it coincidence again. The ancestors called it a return signal. Buried texts resurfaced, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes misinterpreted on purpose. Ethiopian manuscripts, Dogon cosmology, Nubian iconography, all dismissed as isolated anomalies. Funny how patterns become outliers when they don't fit the official frame. Still, once seen, they couldn't be unseen. Archaeology added fuel to the discomfort. Advanced metallurgy, astronomical alignments, urban planning older than accepted timelines. Each discovery quietly challenged the idea that Africa had been waiting to be taught anything. The silence from mainstream narratives grew louder than the evidence itself. Spiritually, the old forces stirred. Not as thunder gods descending from the sky, but as questions that refused to go away. Identity movements, cultural revivals, ancestral callings, all dismissed as trends, as nostalgia. As if memory could be a phase. And beneath that surface awakening, something ancient recalculated. Because remembering isn't passive. It shifts power, reorders stories, destabilizes comfortable myths. The old gods weren't knocking on the door yet, but the ground beneath it was starting to move. As remembrance spread, resistance followed close behind. Not with open force, but with subtle pressure. Ridicule, dilution, academic distance. Ancient knowledge was tolerated as culture, not as truth. Celebrated as art, not as authority. Funny how belief becomes dangerous the moment it stops asking permission. Some symbols were allowed back, but only sanitized. Masks without meaning, rituals without context, deities reduced to metaphors. It looked like inclusion, sounded like respect, yet something essential was missing. Power had been removed, carefully, politely. Still, elders noticed the shift in the air. Dreams intensified. Names long buried resurfaced in meditation, in music, in moments of unexplainable recognition. The old systems didn't demand belief, they responded to alignment, and alignment was quietly returning. Across the globe, parallels became harder to ignore. Sacred numbers matched, creation stories echoed, moral laws mirrored one another across continents supposedly unconnected. Scholars debated diffusion versus coincidence, conveniently avoiding the question of origin. Because if Africa wasn't the receiver but the source, then the entire hierarchy of history tilts. And somewhere between denial and data, the next layer of the war began forming. Not over land or faith, but over who gets to define reality itself. Definition became the new battleground. Universities, institutions, and gatekeepers decided what counted as myth, what qualified as history, and what stayed conveniently undefined. Oral tradition was labeled unreliable, even when it proved more consistent than written records altered by power. Funny how memory becomes suspicious when it can't be edited, yet oral lines carried timestamps science couldn't fake. Genealogies mapped migrations, chants encoded astronomy, proverbs preserved lore. What sounded poetic to outsiders functioned as archive to those who knew how to listen. The problem wasn't lack of data, it was lack of permission to trust it. As debates raged on paper, something else unfolded in the streets. Symbols resurfaced in fashion, murals, tattoos, protest signs, not as nostalgia but as signals. The past wasn't being studied anymore. It was being worn, lived, embodied. Spiritually, the shift felt unmistakable. People spoke of grounding, alignment, ancestral calling, often without knowing why those words felt necessary. The old frameworks didn't arrive demanding worship. They arrived offering coherence in a fractured world. And as coherence spread, discomfort followed. Because a remembered people can't be easily managed. The war of the old gods had moved again, this time into the realm of identity, where the next revelation waited, just beneath the surface. Power reacts when it feels seen. As identities reassembled, systems built on fragmentation grew uneasy. Unity had always been the thing to prevent, not because it was violent, but because it was sovereign. Funny how self-knowledge gets mislabeled as extremism the moment it stops being decorative. Old cosmologies re-emerged as frameworks, not fantasies. Balance over domination, reciprocity over extraction, community over isolation. These weren't trends. They were operating systems refined over millennia. Modern society called them alternatives, as if the current model wasn't already collapsing under its own weight. In quiet moments, the symbols began aligning again: iron with purpose, water with memory, fire with transformation. People felt drawn to elements without knowing why, reenacting rituals stripped of ceremony but heavy with instinct. The sacred doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just feels necessary. Historical parallels sharpened. The law of Ma'at echoed through later moral codes. Divine kingship resurfaced in political theology. Even the concept of a singular hidden creator mirrored older African notions, long dismissed as primitive. Irony stayed consistent. Credit rarely followed origin. And as these realizations settled, a deeper question surfaced. If the old gods shaped the world more than admitted, then what else had been edited out? The answer didn't arrive yet, but the silence around it grew heavier, preparing the ground for the next unveiling. What was edited out often leaves a shadow. And shadows tend to stretch when the light shifts. Forgotten names began surfacing in places no one expected. Academic footnotes, marginal translations, half-erased inscriptions. Funny how truth survives best when no one's looking straight at it. Some discoveries were labeled inconvenient. Temples aligned with stars older than accepted chronologies. Metallurgy that predated supposed innovators. Trade networks spanning continents before globalization had a name. Each find nudged the timeline, just enough to cause discomfort, never enough to rewrite the textbooks. Spiritually, the echoes grew louder, not as commands, but as resonance. People described dreams of rivers, iron gates, serpents of light, symbols recurring across cultures that supposedly never met. Psychology offered explanations. Ancestral memory offered another. In Africa itself, elders spoke carefully. Certain knowledge isn't rushed. Some stories only awaken when the listener is ready. What outsiders called secrecy was often protection, because sacred systems collapse when exposed without context. And so the tension held between evidence and acceptance, between memory and permission. The next layer of the war waited there, not in what was lost, but in what was deliberately left unfinished. Unfinished knowledge has a way of calling the right moment to surface. As fragments aligned, a pattern emerged. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. The old systems hadn't been erased, they had been distributed. Scattered across cultures, faiths, and symbols like a puzzle no one expected to reassemble. Certain rites resurfaced disguised as tradition, folklore, even superstition. Pouring libations without knowing why. Circling fire during celebration. Honoring ancestors while denying the theology behind it. Funny how practice survives belief, waiting patiently for meaning to catch up. Historical records hinted at this continuity. Early travelers described African rituals with uneasy fascination, noting similarities to their own sacred customs. They wrote it off as imitation, never asking who learned from whom. Irony again, the student accusing the teacher of copying. Spiritually, the sensation deepened. People spoke of thresholds, moments of standing between worlds, between past and future. Crossroads returned as symbols of choice and transformation, not coincidence, alignment. The old language speaking through new mouths, and with alignment came risk. Because reassembly threatens narratives built on separation. The War of the Old Gods edged closer to visibility, not as conflict but as convergence, where forgotten pieces finally began finding each other again. Convergence unsettled what relied on division. As fragments met, contradictions sharpened. If wisdom had traveled outward from Africa, then the idea of a single cultural center collapsed. Funny how suddenly complexity becomes controversial when it shifts the origin point. Texts once read in isolation started speaking to each other. Creation accounts echoed across continents. Laws carved in stone mirrored proverbs passed by mouth. Floods, divine breath, chosen vessels, the parallels stacked too neatly to ignore. Scholars argued influence. Elders recognized lineage. Spiritually, the old current felt stronger, not demanding altars or temples, but presence, a sense that time wasn't linear, that ancestors weren't behind, but alongside. The past leaned closer, not to dominate, but to remind. In communities of the diaspora, memory activated through sound and movement. Drums synchronized heartbeats, steps traced patterns older than maps, bodies remembered what names had forgotten. The sacred returned as experience, not explanation. And as experience replaced debate, something shifted again, because once knowledge is felt, it resists erasure. The next unveiling waited there, in the moment when remembrance stopped being personal and started becoming collective. Collective memory moves differently. It doesn't rush, it gathers. As more people recognize the same symbols, the same pull, the same quiet familiarity, remembrance stopped feeling isolated. It became a shared frequency. Funny how what was once dismissed as fringe suddenly felt everywhere. Communities began stitching fragments together, not through doctrine, but through dialogue. Stories from West Africa resonated with ones from the Caribbean. Ritual gestures in Brazil echoed movements in the Sahel. Distance collapsed. What colonization scattered, memory started reuniting. Historically, this wasn't unprecedented. Ancient Africa thrived on networks, spiritual, commercial, intellectual. Knowledge moved with people, not borders. What modern maps split apart, older systems understood as continuity. The rediscovery wasn't new creation, it was restoration. Spiritually, the sense of responsibility deepened. Remembering wasn't just empowering, it was demanding. To know meant to realign actions, values, relationships. The old systems never separated belief from behavior. Wisdom carried weight, and with that weight came a quiet realization. If remembrance had consequences, then forgetting had never been accidental. The story was approaching a threshold where recovery would require choice, and the next mystery would ask who was truly ready to carry it. Choice always reveals what comfort hides. As remembrance crossed that threshold, neutrality became harder to maintain. To remember fully meant questioning foundations, faiths, histories, even personal identities built on borrowed silence. Funny how truth is welcomed as long as it doesn't ask anything in return. Some resisted inwardly. It felt safer to admire the past than to let it reshape the present. Ancient systems demanded balance, accountability, reciprocity. They didn't flatter ego or promise escape. They required participation. And participation changes people. Historically, this was the role of initiation. Knowledge was never handed freely because it altered the one who carried it. Symbols weren't decorative, they were instructions. To know the name of a force meant accepting responsibility for how it moved through you. Spiritually, the language of return sharpened. Not a call backward, but inward. The old gods didn't ask to be worshipped. They asked to be remembered correctly, as principles, as laws of alignment between land, community, and spirit. And there, at the edge of that realization, the war revealed its final shape. Not gods versus gods, not past versus present, but memory versus amnesia. And the next unfolding would decide which one the future was built upon. Amnesia had always been convenient. It asked nothing, challenged nothing, demanded no recalibration of power. To forget was to keep moving without looking down. Funny how forgetting is often framed as peace, while remembering gets blamed for unrest. Yet cracks formed. Social structures built on disconnection began showing strain, spiritual fatigue, identity confusion, hunger without appetite. The old systems had names for this imbalance. They saw it as a warning sign, not a flaw. When the link between ancestor, land, and future breaks, consequences ripple outward. Historically, African cosmologies never separated the spiritual from the political. Leadership was ritualized because power without alignment was considered dangerous. That idea didn't vanish, it was inverted. Authority became secular in name, but spiritually unchecked. Irony again, the fear of primitive belief gave rise to very modern chaos. Spiritually, the response wasn't rebellion, it was grounding. People sought roots, lineage, orientation, not to escape the present, but to survive it with coherence. The old wisdom didn't promise comfort. It offered stability, something far rarer. And as instability grew louder, the final tension sharpened. Because a world built on forgetting can't easily absorb those who choose to remember. The next layer waited there, where ancient balance confronted modern speed. Speed had become the new god. Everything accelerated: information, belief, outrage, forgetting. Ancient systems moved differently. They measured time in seasons, initiations, generations. Funny how slowness gets mistaken for weakness in a world addicted to urgency. The old cosmologies warned about this imbalance. When action outruns meaning, collapse follows. Not as punishment, but as correction. Forests retreat, waters shift, societies fracture. These weren't prophecies, they were observations refined over centuries. Historically, Africa held technologies of restraint, ritual pauses before war, councils before kings spoke, silence as a form of intelligence. Colonization mocked this as inefficiency, then introduced systems that burned through land and people with terrifying speed. Progress, they called it. Spiritually, resistance took a quiet form: recentering, breath over noise, rhythm over rush. People instinctively slowed when reconnecting with ancestral practices, even without knowing why. The body remembered what the calendar forgot, and in that slowing, something became clear. The old gods hadn't fallen because they were weak. They fell because their world refused to move fast enough to survive conquest. The final mystery waited there, in understanding what truly ended the war. What truly ended the war wasn't victory. It was substitution. The old gods didn't fall in battle. They were replaced by systems that moved faster, promised more, and asked fewer questions. Efficiency beat equilibrium. Expansion beat balance. Funny how replacement always pretends to be evolution. History records conversions, reforms, renaissances. What it rarely records is what got displaced to make room. Communal land stewardship became ownership. Cyclical time became deadlines. Sacred obligation turned into private belief. Nothing exploded. It just quietly rearranged itself. Spiritually, this shift dulled perception. When meaning accelerates, depth thins. The old cosmologies required patience because truth unfolded slowly, like initiation. Modern systems preferred immediacy. Revelation on demand. Results without rooting. The sacred couldn't compete on that timeline. Yet replacement never equals erasure. The displaced waits. Under stress, the older layer resurfaces because it was built for endurance, not speed. In moments of collapse, people don't search for the newest idea. They search for the oldest stable one. And that's where the story tightens. Because if the war ended through substitution, not destruction, then endings aren't final. They're conditional. And the last question hangs quietly in the air. What happens when the substitute starts failing? What you've heard wasn't just a story, it was a doorway. Because the legacy of Africa was never meant to sit quietly in museums or footnotes. It lives in rhythm, in memory, in the way balance keeps calling humanity back when excess takes over. The old gods were never trophies of the past. They were teachers of alignment, waiting for ears patient enough to listen again. Beneath deserts, forests, and oceans, countless mysteries still sleep. Temples not yet uncovered, names not yet spoken aloud, wisdom sealed not by time, but by readiness. History may have turned the page, but the book was never finished, only paused. And now, as the world searches for grounding, for meaning beyond speed and consumption, those ancient principles stir once more, not demanding devotion, but offering remembrance. Not asking to replace anything, but to restore what was broken when memory was cut away. So if this revelation resonated with you, stay close. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and walk with us into the next unveiling. Because many truths are still hidden and the ancestors didn't guard them for nothing.